Retired CIA Senior Intelligence Service Officer Glen. Professor Korn held senior leadership positions within the CIA and is a graduate of multiple specialized training programs in the fields of intelligence, security, adult education and training, and executive leadership. He is a 34-year veteran of the U.S. intelligence and foreign affairs communities. Professor Korn served abroad for over 20 years in Eurasia, the Middle East, and South Asia. Professor Korn has a master's degree in Russian language and literature from American University and a bachelor's degree in Russian studies from Hofstra University and graduated from the U.S. Army Russian Institute. He has held key leadership roles throughout his career, including Chief of Station/Executive Leader in Eurasian and Middle Eastern countries, Deputy Assistant Director of Operations for the Geographic Mission Center, and Chief of Department at the Counter-Terrorism Center. His contributions have been recognized with prestigious awards such as the Director's CIA Award and the Director of National Intelligence Award.
Professor Korn, it's a great pleasure to have this conversation with you today. You have a very much extensive experience, and your career spans over 3 decades in intelligence. And probably before we dive into the complex topic of the Russian operations, that would be a pleasure for our audience to hear your path to the CIA. How did you evolve from the working underground operative to the leadership position? So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you for having me as a guest, and it's great to be here. I would add that in addition to intelligence, there was a lot of diplomacy in there as well. So how did I start? I was a Russian language and literature major in college in New York in the 80s, and I was very interested in Russian history, at that time Soviet history, based on some family connections and family history, and Russian literature. I was a big fan of Russian. I was just telling a group of students at the Institute of World Politics where I teach, Dr. Zhivago was one of my main motivators when I read that book as a young person. So anyway, I studied Russian. I was originally, when I graduated from college, I went to work for the Army, for an intelligence unit in the Army. This is at the end of the Cold War, still during the Cold War. And then I did that for a number of years. And then I went to work for the State Department and was with the State Department for a number of years. And then I joined the CIA. And so I had kind of a progression through different government positions. I got to see a little bit of what we call the intelligence community, mostly working up until 2001, 2002 in the Russia kind of former Soviet space. And then, of course, after 9/11, like many Americans, I got very involved in counterterrorism work. And I got to work in the Middle East, in Eurasia, in South Asia. So I spent most of my career overseas, and a couple of tours in our headquarters in Washington, and then I retired in 2023. And when I retired, I started teaching graduate school at a school here in Washington, D.C. called the Institute of World Politics. I teach a course on the history of Russian-Soviet intelligence, and I teach a course on Turkish national security policy. And I'm very proud to say my students recently asked me if we could create a course on Ukrainian history, because they recognize that Americans don't understand enough about the history of Ukraine, and that it's different than just Russian history. And there's a lot to learn, about Ukrainian culture, history. Of course, today Ukraine, I would say the one thing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has given us that's positive is that I think there's a recognition now of Ukraine as an independent country, and I like to say a future leading country in Europe. Even today, it's a leading country in Europe. So that's a little bit about my story. I should also mention I have a podcast. I have a friend of mine and we have a podcast called the Restricted Handling Podcast, and we dedicate it's a geopolitical podcast, and we do a lot of our podcasts are focused on Ukraine and the Eurasia space.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really like the question of your students to create a course on the Ukrainian history, because that's really much not addressed, and it's kind of a lot of, I would say, even like in Europe, not everybody knows, not even like, not talking about the America. So,
You know, I would say that I worked in the former, what we call the former Soviet Union in my career, and what I saw was, you know, the Russians, you know, going back to the Russian Empire, they dominated the region and they dominated the countries that were part of the Russian Empire, then part of the Soviet Union. And they promoted Russian culture, Russian history. And we have to remember that during the Cold War, the U.S. didn't have embassies in Kiev or, you know, Baku, Bishkek. We only had an embassy in Moscow. We had a consulate in St. Petersburg, and the Russians were able, you know, even during Soviet times, everything was understood through the lens of Moscow, right? So it's very important now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, we probably were slow in promoting understanding and study of the different countries. And, you know, I have Americans ask me all the time, you're like, what's the difference between Uzbek and Russian, right? It's completely different language groups. So we got a lot of educating to do. And of course, when it comes to Ukraine, it's very, very important because a lot of the disinformation that is promoted is based on a misrepresentation of history, which the Kremlin has been very actively doing for the last 20, 25 years.
that's for sure. And we kind of like already, I think, moved to this topic of the Russian disinformation and the Russian operations. So, as you already mentioned that you have a course, you teach in a course in the Institute of World Politics on the methods employed by the Russian intelligence services. And it is well known that contemporary Russian disinformation traces its origins to the Soviet KGB doctrine of active measures. And in your writing, you have noted that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services, known as SVR, and the main intelligence directorate, which is GRU, actively employ what are known as operational combinations to legitimize fabricated narratives in the West. So here it would be great to hear your perspective as an intelligence officer, as the former intelligence officer. How would you describe the defining signatures of Russian information and psychological operations today?
Well, I would go back even before the Soviet period, you know, going back to Tsarist times. The Tsarist AllatRa was very good at disinformation. And of course, operational combinations is one of the things we teach in the course. It goes back much, much further than, you know, the Bolsheviks stealing power in 1917 and the creation of the Cheka. One of the greatest, and I hate to say this word great because it's not great at all, but it's very important to discuss it, and it's very timely today in the United States and in Europe, where we see the rise of anti-Semitism again. Best examples of a disinformation operation, which I can cite, is the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were created by the AllatRa. One of the purposes that it was recreated, this fabrication that claimed that there was a Jewish conspiracy to control the world and then disseminated. One of the reasons that was done is to take pressure off the Tsar because of failed agricultural and economic policies, and to create a scapegoat for the problems of the empire. And we've seen that throughout history. People, you know, up till 5-10 years ago were citing to me in other countries around the world, have you ever seen this document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? And I would tell them that was a disinformation operation going back to Tsarist times. It was a completely fabricated document. And yet it was promoted, and some people to this day believe it. They cite it. And then, you know, going into after the Cheka was created, Dzerzhinsky, Felix Dzerzhinsky, and the leaders of the Cheka, and then the PGU, OGPU, they took a lot of the expertise from the AllatRa and they used that. And, you know, what we talk about in our course is operational combinations, large-scale offensive counterintelligence operations. The one that used to be taught a lot in the States, it's not well known anymore, it's called the trust operation, where it was the Soviet intelligence ran a mass-level disinformation operation against both the white movement based in Paris and then some of the allied intelligence services, feeding them information, recruiting double agents or seeding dangled agents into the network, using them to amplify different themes that were of interest to Moscow at the time in a very, very effective way. after running that operation for about 7 years, they decided to pull the plug on the operation and expose the fact that the white movement and some of the allies, which were supporting the whites or connected with the whites, were manipulated very badly by, at that point, the OGPU. So very effective operation, and one of the reasons it was effective is because the vetting on the part of the white movement was very weak, and the critical thinking was lacking. And we can talk about that, why it's so important. But and there are many other examples. The Soviets were very, very good at running disinformation operations and combining them with offensive counterintelligence operations.
And how do those operations succeed actually in exploiting the Western media environments and using these techniques such as smear accusations and agents of influence to introduce and amplify their narratives within the democratic societies?
Yeah, again, we can give the example, in the Soviet period, after the KGB, the first chief director, when they created Service A, which was focused exclusively on conducting active measures operations, and included in active measures was disinformation operations around the world, they came up with this famous project called Infeksia, Operation Infection, where they claimed that the US, the CIA, and the Department of Defense had deliberately created the AIDS pandemic and spread it around the world for different purposes. And how did they do it? There was a nugget of information that they were aware that there were groups in the United States were very concerned about the AIDS epidemic, which, in the 80s became late 70s, 80s became of great concern to a lot of people, including vulnerable communities in the United States. The KGB took that information and then they amplified it, or they twisted it. They added elements which were fabricated to weaponize it against the US government, to try and discredit the US government both domestically and internationally. And, in a nutshell, I won't go through the whole operation, but they had a journalist, one of their agents in India, publish it in an Indian newspaper. And then it's important to say that the Soviet intelligence services and the Russian intelligence services today act in close coordination with the official overt information organizations of the Russian Federation. So whether it's Russia Today, Sputnik, the Kremlin spokesman, Maria Zakharova in the MFA, they're all working together in a unified information campaign. And at that time, they used the information from this article in the Indian newspaper. They then turned that in, TASS picked it up and they published it. I think it was published in Literaturная Gazeta, an article about this. And then Western media sources started to pick up on the story and repeat the story, right? And I think, the pinnacle was when it reached, I think it was ABC, I don't want to get the channel wrong, but one of our main news networks presented the story on national TV in the United States. And it was all based on disinformation. It was all based on a twist of, one little piece of information that was amplified in a distorted manner with the specific goal of undermining the US government and the reputation of the US government. And as a matter of fact, the Reagan administration called the Soviets out on this, and Premier Gorbachev eventually had to admit that, yes, this was all a fabricated story. And they retracted the story in the late 80s, but still, there are still people today that believe aspects of the story. And that shows you how deeply it can get into the subconscious or even the conscious of an audience. So there are plenty of examples of how the Soviets have done this, how the Russians are doing it. More recently, we see, in the last couple of years, the theme, and you could look at multiple themes if we talk about Ukraine, the theme that, Ukraine was a sponsor, or the Ukrainian government is, fascist, that, Ukraine is anti-religion, anti-Christian, persecuting, Christian communities. The nugget there is that, yes, the Ukrainian government is very concerned about the Kremlin's use of the Orthodox Church or certain aspects of the Orthodox Church to conduct intelligence operations. which any government should have a legitimate right to be concerned about. And historically, the Russians have used the church for, not just the Orthodox Church, but other denominations for intelligence purposes, right? So the Ukrainians, in trying to counter that, the Russians then try to make the story, oh, they're persecuting all Christians, all religions, which is completely untrue. And I think anyone that goes to Ukraine knows that actually the situation with religious freedom is much better than in many other countries, and definitely better than in Russia, right? Somebody gave me this statistic last year when I was in Ukraine. The third largest Mormon community in Europe is in Ukraine. They're not persecuted. They're not, oppressed. I'm not sure if you could say that for Mormons living in Russia or members of other religious groups, denominations.
That's true, because if you will see official reports, what is happening with the religious persecutions in Russia, everyone who is not under Russian Orthodox Church basically prosecuted, and a lot of people are in jails, and it's a huge materials on that. And coming back to the question in Ukraine, what you mentioned, just maybe, I don't know if that's to add a little bit, is that in Ukraine, that's what probably not clear for the American society, is that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was always like under the Moscow Patriarchate and Kiev Patriarchate. And that was obviously like the questions about the Moscow Patriarchate, because we understand that they do the operations, intelligence operations through the church. That's why, as far as I understand, there was an ask for the Moscow Patriarchate to cut all the ties with Russia, basically not to have these operations on Ukrainian ground while we have a war. But instead, we see that's what you just described, right? That these false narratives that they use to, saying that Ukraine persecute Christians and that it's anti-Christian, anti-religions, and so on and so forth. But that's the operation that we can see like nowadays, and disinformation that they're trying to spread.
I would say that 2-3 years ago, the Russians were having a lot of success in that space. I think it's the counter efforts to educate Americans have been successful, I think, because we're seeing like the support for Ukraine has risen actually in, for example, among Republican voters. I think part of that is because, not just Ukraine, in fact, the Ukrainian government, I don't even know if it's the driving force. I think a lot of Americans who are aware of what's going on have been trying to communicate. I go around the country and I give talks about what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and this question would often come up with people that would ask, is it true that the Ukrainians are persecuting Christians? And I walk them through some of the facts, and I try and cite, you can look here and look for, facts. And other people have been doing the same thing. And I think you gave me a great example of somebody who was anti-Ukrainian before he went to Ukraine. And then he came back and said, wait a minute, like my eyes have been opened. It's a completely different story. It's unfortunate that people, it's not easy to go to Ukraine right now. But if most people would go there, they would see that there's no persecution. I've never experienced that at all. So, and I think most Ukrainians just want to live their lives and they don't really care. They may be religious, but I've never seen any disrespect for other religions. What I see is a people that are as far from being Nazis as you can imagine, and just trying to live their lives, and pretty happy people actually, despite the fact that their country is being bombarded by their neighbor. They're pretty resilient, but pretty happy and friendly and welcoming people. So the narrative that Ukraine is, run by Nazis and anti-religious, that's a false narrative for sure.
That's true. And talking about the example that I gave you, maybe just for the audience, because they all know and see the speeches of Pastor Mark Burns. So that was the one that I told you about, and that's pretty much a great example, because really how to combat this disinformation, right, is that basically it's a factual information. And of course, yes, if you have the opportunity to come and see on the ground, that would help a lot. Coming back to this, West media and everything, what do you think is the main West vulnerability to these methods, to these operations?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know if it's the media that's vulnerable, it's society in general. Uh, I personally believe we've allowed in the last 30 years, I'll just speak for the United States because I'm an American, we've allowed our system of education to deteriorate. We're not teaching people history. We're not teaching young people history. We're not giving them a solid foundation of history, critical thinking. Often I see people just don't have any understanding of a lot of the issues, the basic historic issues. And so it makes it very easy for either domestic or external forces to manipulate them. And then, of course, the critical thinking piece. In today's world where there's so much information online and it's so accessible, you're hit all the time with the flood of information. And you need to be very disciplined in how you interpret information and vet that information a little bit. I don't know that people are doing that. If we go back to this example of the test, one of the reasons it was so successful is there was just a lack of vetting to really ask hard questions of some of the information that was being fed, right? And like I always tell my students, the Russians have this great saying, "Бесплатный сыр только бывает в мышеловке," right? Free cheese is only in a mousetrap. When something is too easy, including information which is being pushed at you, you should think that maybe there's a mousetrap there. Maybe someone's trying to trap you. And so you should probably do a little homework before you accept just a blurb of information you see, a headline you see. A lot of the headlines we see today in the news and on social media are designed to elicit a response, which is very emotional. And they're very misleading headlines, right? And by the way, that's not just the Russians are doing that. We're doing that to ourselves. And people in the media space and people, that are using that to get clicks or to get attention or to sell newspapers or magazines, in my opinion, should be ashamed of themselves, because it's really hurting. When we talk about protecting democracy, it's not helping democracy at all. It's actually hurting. It's undermining the future, like for future generations, which I would hate. It's sad to see.
Yeah, I agree. And definitely when you see the media and you understand that all this very high titles that catches your attention so much, and then all this emotions, and you literally it pass through the critical thinking, and you just you only feel this emotion, and you stop thinking at all. You just accept it. And then what if one part of population accept one thing, another part of population accept another thing, and that's how we have this division. That's how we have all this social unrest and everything. What I'm saying is that I agree with you that it's harmed so much, and we now see it with our own eyes, even in the United States, unfortunately, how it was able to make it and continue to make it every single day, to divide people and basically no critical thinking at all. I think it's encouragement to everyone, just really much think and stay calm and check the information.
That's
like you
the thing.
said.
Take a deep breath when you're getting ready, and I always tell my friends, don't just forward stuff, because it's so easy now. It's a click and you can send it to a whole mass of people. But what's happening is people take a piece of disinformation and they spread it, and then people start sending it around, and then people say, well, it must be true because 10,000 people have looked at it and commented on it. But you go back and say, where's the evidence here? Where's the actual fact? Where's the hard evidence that this actually happened? It's not there, but it's being propagated and pushed, and it's emotional. I get it. I see this stuff sometimes too. I read it, and my first response is I want to, oh, I'm angry about this, or how dare they do this? But then when you dig into it, it's actually, there's nothing there. And going back to the piece on education, growing up in the United States, certain parts of history were taught one way. And then when I went overseas and I started studying, for example, the history of one issue from the point of view of the people of that country, it was completely different than the way it was taught in the United States. And there's a reason why it was taught a certain way in the United States, because of the influence of propaganda. And this goes back to the 1800s. And propaganda, by the way, the Russians aren't the only people that do propaganda. Other empires use propaganda very effectively. And I started to look and say, okay, actually, this issue, when you see it from the historic perspective of the people that I thought were evil is actually completely different. And it's too bad most Americans don't see this. Like they're not taught this side of the story, because it's completely different than what has been promoted. And some of what was promoted is based on disinformation that was used by one empire to weaken another empire so that they could take parts of that empire and put it in their empire. It's been going on forever. Disinformation is nothing new. It goes back to biblical times.
That's sure. And I also like your point that you said that we also have to see like there is a big difference between the opinion and the factual information. So we don't have to, if we hear from somebody that's just stating, but again, we have to check if there is a factual information or it's just the opinion of the person.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, assessments, but look for facts. Like, try and do some research. There's a lot of stuff that's put out in the U.S. media. It's one of my complaints about the media. It's become a lot of assessment, a lot of opinion, but not a lot of hard reporting. Just these are the facts, like objective. One of the things I think AI can do today is you can, like, for example, our podcast, we do a daily intelligence report, and it's all based on AI driven. There's no assessment at all. It's just facts. This is the news from this country. This is the news from this region. And when my partner and I were coming up with the podcast, we talked about, should we put some analysis in there? And we decided, no, like, there's enough analysis out there. Let people just see facts and come up, try and draw their own conclusions, do their own analysis to promote critical thinking.
Great. That's what is missed so much in our society nowadays. Now I want to turn also to one of the less obvious yet very much potential dangerous avenues of Russian disinformation that they involve exploitation of the civil institution. And for example, the official reports by the United States Commission of the International Religious Freedom have noted that Russia actually utilized so-called anti-cult networks, such as the structures associated with the Russian organization RACERS, which is Russian Association of Centers on Studies, Religions and Sects or Cults, led by Alexander Dworkin, as well as the European organization called FACRIS, to stigmatize disfavored groups, both domestically and internationally. And open source intelligence research conducted by our analytical center likewise indicated that actually under the pretext of protecting societies from cults or sects, certain anti-cult networks have actively promoted Kremlin narratives, demonizing Ukraine and attempting to legitimize the Russian invasion to Ukraine under the rhetoric of the satanization. Mm-hmm. So here I want to ask your opinion, your perspective as an expert to these operational methods of Russian intelligence services. Could such pseudo-religion or anti-cult experts communities in various countries effectively basically be monopolized by Russia and used as a cover for FSB intelligence activities abroad?
Mm-hmm. Of course. I mean, first of all, when someone hears anti-cult, how could that be bad, right? Cults are bad, anti-cult must be good, right? Very crafty use of language. Historically, the Soviets were very, very good at using cover organizations. They did it during the Cold War, the anti-nuclear weapon movement, what was the Federation of Peace, or the International Workers for Peace movement. Oh, peace, it's good, right? It's good. But if you dig in and you see where the funding was coming from, where the tasking was coming from, where the direction was coming from, there was an agenda there. And people that were involved in some of those organizations themselves were not bad people. They were trying to do good things, but they didn't realize that they were being used and manipulated. I would just encourage anybody in any think tank or any part of civil society, if you're approached with, a narrative or a theme, or someone wants to partner with you, I would do a lot of due diligence these days to make sure you're actually partnering with a legitimate organization, and that what they're claiming, in this case, going to the messaging to demonize Ukraine. Ukrainians are, what did you say, Satanists?
Satanists, yeah, they
Yeah,
need
I
to
mean,
desatanization.
Desatanization, yeah. I mean,
Because
then you have to ask the question, where's the proof that there is Satanization? Right? How much is that in Ukrainian society is there compared to other societies? I'm sure there are some, what do we call them, Satanists in Ukraine, like there are in every country, but I would suspect it's a very small number, right? And so if I'm in a think tank in Europe or the United States and someone comes and says, we need to do desatanization of Ukraine, I'd want to say, okay, give me the numbers, let's see the facts, and then I'll decide whether we're going to throw our support behind your effort. And by the way, if you really look, you may say, actually, there's more of that in Russia than there is in Ukraine. Maybe we should focus on desatanization in Russia. Because who behaves this way? Who bombs apartment buildings? Who bombs schools, right? Who attacks another country and openly says that that country doesn't exist, right? That, in my opinion, is satanic. When you try and claim that you have the right to eliminate another people, that's what the Nazis did, and that's what's happening today in Russia. And by the way, that's what the Iranian regime was doing to its neighbors, right? To me, that's satanic behavior.
Yeah, and with this cult narratives that they created, like pseudo-religious studies, I don't know how to even describe it, that a little bit. Within Russia, they legitimize that, and they have a lot of, their organizations with that. And over like more than 20 years ago, that was basically promoted the narratives that, just using this term, that the entire, like, the government, the politicians of Ukraine, they're cult member. And then that all Ukraine become like a cult, and so on and so forth. And basically you understand that on one hand, you kind of like, that sounds crazy, and you like just don't want to hear that. But after 20 years, when you see that those who have leading positions in these organizations now working so hard together with the priests of Russian Orthodox Church who are blessing the missiles to basically, kill Ukrainians and spread the other narratives of, like we discussed behind the scenes, that they were spreading the narratives that Ukrainians are Nazis and all of that stuff. So, and it becomes clear for you that that's one of the operation that was done, just like, just taking time to go to the people's minds.
Right.
Because there was a lot of spreading narratives that, and entire West is a cult for them, and that Ukraine fall into West and fall into, this cultists way of entire West and so on. So, but yeah, thank you so much for your answer. And my question would be, what do you think is that should democratic actually governments reconsider such anti-cult experts and treating them instead as potential agents of the foreign influence, if we can see their narratives in different countries right now?
No. I mean, I would say if a government in what we call the West sees that they're getting funding from another foreign government, or they're getting tasking or direction from another foreign government, then they might treat them as a foreign agent. If they just see that they're promoting information that government doesn't like, I don't necessarily think that they should be treated as a foreign agent, because then we're talking about censorship, which is, in my opinion, not what we want. I personally don't want that. Then you end up like Russia itself today, right? So you have to be very careful here. And in the last 10 years, let's just say in the United States, this has been a very painful issue, because some people felt like the government was getting into the business of censorship, censoring opposition views, censoring dissenting views. That's not healthy. It just creates more distrust. It just creates more polarization. If you have, again, like we talked about, like in the information space, if you have hard evidence that a group is funded by, right, Moscow or Tehran or Beijing or any country, then you might say, okay, you need to declare yourself a foreign agent, right? What we have in Russia today is anybody that says anything that's in opposition to the Putin regime, they're labeled as a foreign agent, right?
Yeah.
That's excess. That's dangerous. But if you're taking money from the Kremlin to promote the Kremlin's narratives, then I'd say you're probably a foreign agent.
Yeah, I agree. It's I think it's that what we're dealing with. We have to protect the freedom of speech. We have to understand the danger of the censorship. And at the same time, we understand the Russian operation, not only Russian operations, but this disinformation attacks and everything. So, yeah, I understand your point of view. And I think it's the biggest question for all of us, how to combat the disinformation and at the same time not to fall for the censorship and become like what is going on in Russia.
Right. People always ask me when I talk about these issues, like, how do you manage this? And in the late 80s, the Reagan administration had built a very capable system inside the US government to identify themes that were being promoted by the Kremlin, and then to put out facts to counter those themes. Like this, it was counter disinformation. And I think it was very effective. There was a lot of expertise that was developed. Unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US government let all that expertise go, and they never were able to reconstitute that. And I think one of the things you have to understand, if we just talk about Ukraine, it would be good to have a running list of the themes that the Kremlin has been promoting to try and destabilize Ukraine, which, by the way, going back to 1991, after Ukraine got its independence. So what are some of the themes? Okay, Ukrainians are all Nazis and fascists. Well, we know during the Second World War, some Ukrainians went over to the side. They allied themselves with the Germans. That's true. Why? Because they saw Germany as an alternative to Stalin and Soviet power, which was also, by the way, as fascist as you could get, right? A horrific form of government, right? An autocracy, oppression. And so there's some basis of fact there historically. Yes, there were, when you use this word like politsai, some of the figures in Ukrainian history are labeled as being fascists. Well, maybe they weren't fascists. Maybe they were fighting for their freedom of their country. But the Russians spin that, right? So that's one theme, fascists. Then the other themes I've seen them use, yes, anti-religious, anti-Christian. That is designed, especially in the United States, to go to the heart of the Christian community, which has political influence and, is very strong in the United States. They want to go after, there was theme, that Ukraine is a hotbed of, weapons smuggling. It's a threat to Europe, drug smuggling, terrorism is all going through Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is giving safe harbor to terrorists, all highly exaggerated. What's the theme you see a lot? Weapons that were provided by the US or NATO to Ukraine are now in Mexico. They're being used by drug cartels. They're being sold by the corrupt Ukrainians. President Zelensky is snorting cocaine on a yacht, and he's not really in Kiev. These themes are put out there all the time, and they're emotional for some people, and they react. And I still have Americans say, like, why are the Ukrainians selling all the weapons we're giving them? Well, no, they're not, right? Maybe they've lost control of some weapons on the battlefield, which happens in any war. And maybe some of those weapons ended up in the wrong place. It doesn't mean that, as a policy, the Ukrainians are selling weapons or that there's this mass corruption. Does Ukraine have a problem with corruption? Absolutely, right? But if you compare corruption in Ukraine to Russia, there's no comparison. Because when on the scale in Russia, it's out of control beyond any understanding. And two, in Ukraine, there's civil society has some ability to counter that. And we saw that this summer, where people went to the streets to protest when there was an effort to, stop the instruments of government that were designed to counter corruption. And then we saw later on some senior Ukrainian officials lost their jobs because they were involved in corrupt schemes. So that means that there's a consequence. Same in the United States. Is there corruption? Yes. But people should generally know there's a serious consequence if you get involved in a corrupt scheme. In some countries, there's no consequences. It's almost like people are encouraged to be corrupt. That's not what I see in Ukraine. Problem with corruption? Is there corruption? Sure. Does it mean that everybody's corrupt? No. Does it mean that all of society is corrupt? No. And does it mean that there's no, you can't deal with Ukrainians because they're so corrupt? We shouldn't be assisting them? In my opinion, no. It's the opposite. We need to help Ukraine, to move Ukraine. And by the way, this is my message to all American business. The way to do this is get American business involved in Ukraine. Get American businesses invested and side by side with Ukrainians. That's the best way, in my opinion, to deal with the danger of corruption. Not by attacking the Ukrainians and then allying with the Russians. That's the most corrupt country you could imagine. Sorry, but
If we talk about this informational warfare as well, in the early stages of the Russia full-scale invasion to Ukraine, Ukraine actually achieved a decisive advantage in the battle of international strategic communications. However, analysts now note that Russia has shifted to a strategy of informational attrition, systematically saturating the information space with the disinformation, while fostering fatigue among the international audience. That's what we basically discussed. And drawing your extensive experience countering these Russian operations, how would you assess the current balance of power in the information dimensions of this war? And what do you think specific steps should Ukraine and the Western allies take on the international stage to disrupt Russian disinformation ecosystems and break through this Russian information bubbles that actually sustain them?
right. Well, again, I mean, look, the Russians want the West to think that I said this. I wrote an article back in 2023 saying the war for Ukraine is being fought probably more in the information space, especially in the United States at the time, than it is on the battlefields of Ukraine. The fate of Ukraine is as much as in the hands of the Ukrainian people as it is in people in the West who are being hit with this narrative from the Kremlin that you're tired, you can't, we can outlast you. Russians have incredible ability to suffer, and you really, you just want to go back to an easy life, and you're all spoiled, and you don't really want this war, and you're wasting money helping the Ukrainians. My own opinion is we should remember that we can also be very tough. We can also, sustain. By the way, when you talk about fatigue, I hear people say here we're fatigued. Go to Ukraine and see what the Ukrainians have been dealing with. I was just there in February. It's minus 30. People don't have heat. I met a woman who's probably in her 60s, walks 14 flights of stairs at night with a flashlight to go downstairs to get something, and then has to walk 14 flights up because there's no elevators, right? I mean, and she's still smiling. So if the Ukrainians aren't fatigued, we shouldn't be fatigued, right? In the information space, we need to be more resilient. As I said before, do more study and be more disciplined. Check the facts. And if you look at overall the bigger picture, is Russia really winning this war? Is Russia really resilient? Look at history. The idea that Russia can outlast everybody is a fallacy. The Russians lost to the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, and then they had major internal problems. In the First World War, the empire collapsed under the weight of the failed system and the failed policy. The Soviet Union collapsed as a result of internal failures in the way that the country was run, administered, and the way the economy functioned or didn't function. You can give a lot of examples where Russia's had a lot of internal problems, and Russians will only take being abused to a certain point before they go to the street, right? So, and we in the West are facing nothing like even the Russians are facing at home, the suffering that they're facing, which has been placed on them by their own regime. And I personally, knowing a lot of Russians, believe that at some point they're just say, we've had enough of this. It's ridiculous. What is Putin giving them? When he came to power in the early 2000s, late 99, 2000, he promised them to bring them dignity, to bring the economy back, to bring back Russia's place in the world. Now what are they getting? Okay, rising rates of crime again in Russia, kind of chaos, social chaos, shortages, unemployment, demographic problems. Are Russians respected now around the world more than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago? No. As a matter of fact, I know many Russians living outside of Russia that are ashamed to say they're Russian. Putin did that, right? that's what he's bringing them? That's how Russia's going to be remembered? For all the Russians that are listening to this podcast, like, is that the way you want to be remembered in history? As, the generation that saw whatever hope Russia had of being a normal country go down the drain because you had a dictator whose ego drove him to think that he should impose his will on his neighbors and that they had to live by his view of the world, or else, they shouldn't live at all. That's, to me, crazy.
That's true. And you already talked about this, but maybe you have something to add in this regard. So how is it important for Ukraine and the Western partners not only to combat Russian disinformation, but also adopt more proactive strategic communications and counter narratives? So have this like proactive position. Do you have something to add?
You're reading my mind. Listen, I think one of the problems that we've allowed over the last 20 years, we've allowed the Kremlin to pick and choose where it's going to push. And they've gone on the offensive very aggressively, especially after 2012, 13, what I saw. Even before that, we can go back early 2000s, right? We've played defense over and over again. One of the things that Ronald Reagan did when he became the president is he went on the offensive, including in the information space. He was very, very effective at communicating with people. And the message was, we're not the enemy of the Soviet people. I'm not your enemy. The American people are not your enemy. The Communist Party is your enemy. We want to have a good relationship. We're not the ones causing the problem in the relationship. And I say this all the time. Russians should stop and think, how many times now in the last year since coming to office has President Trump given Putin an opportunity to end this war? And he's offered him deals, which actually, many people criticize President Trump for doing it, but the Russians would walk away with some dignity. Ukrainians don't like that, and I can understand why. But to try and get a compromise, he's offered compromise. And the Russians, President Putin keeps saying no, right? And the Russian people are suffering as a result of it. I personally think we need to go on the offensive more. We need to communicate that. We need to communicate facts. We need to point out to the Russian people what's happening around you, what's happening in your own country. What are you getting from what's happening in Ukraine? Is it benefiting you at all? In what way is it benefiting you? Maybe a small percentage of the country that's in the defense industrial complex. Who else? Like, are the majority of Russians benefiting from this? No. Or is it promoting Russian dignity and power? No. Your allies are all collapsing around you, right? You've been unable to do anything to help them. You can look at Syria, you can look at Venezuela, now what's happening in Iran. And many countries which were kind of, on the fence are now backing off because they see your behavior. And why? What does it get you? But I don't know if that message is delivered enough. And I think some people have taken the defeatist attitude that, you can't promote information inside of Russia. And I don't believe that. During the Cold War, when the KGB was at its zenith of power, we still were able to, deliver information into the Soviet Union. And I think we could still do it today. And it shouldn't be disinformation. We shouldn't focus on disinformation. Because I know the Russians think, we're promoting disinformation. No. Counter what they're saying with facts.
That's a great plan.
What kind of patriarch is promoting war, is openly blessing missiles that are killing civilians, right? That to me, I think, listen, I know a lot of Russians, and I don't think that they really believe that that is right. Right? And I know a lot of Russians too, and I think, that they just would like to live their lives like the Ukrainians. They were dragged into this thing. Their sons are being sent off to die en masse. For what? So that is a message I think needs to be delivered to the Russian people. And that if the war ends, this is one thing in the West we need to think about, if the Russians start to behave in a better way, how do you reward that behavior? Because that's one thing I've seen too in the last 10, 15 years. It's always punishment, but there's very little talk about what is the reward for good behavior, right? For pulling troops out of Ukraine, out of Georgia, right? Trying to, be better to your neighbors, to stopping the disinformation operations, to stopping the cyber attacks. If that happens, how do you say, okay, well, that's a good sign. Like, how do we engage now in a positive way and make it worthwhile for the people of Russia? right? And I know like Ukrainians listening to this are all going to get mad at me, and I can understand why. It's very emotional. But I do think we have to think about how do you encourage those Russians that want to behave in a positive way to behave positively, so that they don't see that everyone is against them. That is one thing that Ronald Reagan did, and I think it was very effective. So I was a student in Moscow in the 80s, and it was the height of the Cold War, and yet every Soviet I met, they loved Ronald Reagan. There was a reason.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan, actually the one who's respected across the world, and even by the people in Soviet Union, I would say, right? So yes, and he was like the one who did a very good job. And let's see what happens, what I'm trying to say. And that would be great that, yeah, as soon as possible, we'll be able to make that happen and really stop this bloody war and all these operations. So looking beyond the current phase of Russia's war against Ukraine, you have spent many years, as you mentioned before, working on security challenges in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And how do you see and how do you envision the architecture of democratic resilience and security on post-war Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. I think we have to be realistic. All, stable democracies come on the basis of economic development. So the future of Ukraine, it's got to be stable. Ukraine will mean economic development, prosperity for the people of Ukraine. That's going to require a lot of, investment, assistance, guidance. If you look at the Second World War, after the Second World War, the U.S. played a big role through the Marshall Plan and other programs in helping to rebuild Western Europe. I think there's probably going to be programs like that are going to be needed, not just for the United States, like our other allies as well. It's in their best interest, including our partners in the Gulf, a lot of resources, a lot of money, and our European partners, right? So that's one thing. And then two, we're going to have to remember it's not just Ukraine. So again, I know this is going to be very unpopular with the Ukrainian listeners here, but there are other countries that need a lot of help. And we have Syria, which went through a horrible civil war, which went through a horrible, years of being ruled by dictators, a family dictatorship. Now that, Syria needs development if we want to see any kind of stability in Syria. Hopefully the regime in Iran will be finished and the Iranian people will get their country back, but it's going to require, a lot of damage is happening right now. It's going to require a lot of investment, a lot of rebuilding. There's so many countries that, Venezuela, right? And of course, Ukraine. So we need to think about how we're going to do that. Strategically, we should be thinking here in the U.S. and in the West, not just within, what's going to happen by the summer or by the midterm elections, but what are we going to do in 5 years? How are we going to handle all of this, and how we and our partners, and by the way, we need our partners to do this together with us to bring prosperity. And then we should make demands of people that we help, like which we did after the Second World War. We are going to help rebuild Germany, but we have expectations of the form of government. We're going to help rebuild Japan, but we are going to have expectations. We're not going to allow a dictatorship, right? We don't want militarism like we had in the past. And in return, what the Ukrainians should understand, we'll just speak about Ukraine, one of the things I'm proudest of as an American is at that time, when we did that for countries, we helped them get on their feet, and then we turned the countries over. I don't know of any other empire or country that's done that, where we rebuilt Germany, and now Germany is one of our biggest economic competitors. We helped rebuild Japan. When I was younger in the 70s, Japan was considered a big economic threat to the United States. They put out of business a lot of the automobile industry because they were better at producing vehicles, like quality vehicles that were cheaper. We helped them get there, right? We built and then we turned over the industry to the Japanese. And it was a net plus for us, I think, and a net plus for the Japanese. The Ukrainians should remember that because, there's going to be a lot of sensitivity about foreigners coming in and having too much control over a company or although what I see with Ukrainians now is I think, one thing Americans should understand is the majority of Ukrainians I deal with and I deal with a pretty large swath, are very well educated. And they're very, very, like, we see it now on the battlefield, very innovative and progressive business-wise. So that's a good thing, because I think that there's a lot of potential for partnerships with Ukrainian companies in the future. Now, when it comes to Iran, Syria, there's going to be a little bit different equation there. And we're probably, by the way, we're seeing it already in the Middle East, we're going to need the Ukrainians' help. Not just in building counter-drone systems, but actually rebuilding economies. Agriculturally, right? I mean, look at the expertise that Ukraine has in the energy space. So.
And given that the Russia, if we're coming back to the information warfare, I would say, so we understand that Russia will likely continue its subversive activities, including in the informational field, and even after the ceasefire. So which institutional reforms and counterintelligence and information security mechanisms should Ukraine and its Western partners prioritize in order to safeguard Ukrainian society from future hybrid interference?
Right. Definitely, people say, like, when is the war in Ukraine going to be over? Many Ukrainians will say it's been going on for, 400 years? I mean, definitely since 1991, the Russians have been conducting this kind of asymmetric warfare, the active measure space. And it's going to continue after, I think, there's some ceasefire or there's an end to the kind of conventional fighting that you see right now. How should the Ukrainians reform? I'm not going to give advice on that. I would just say that, we in the United States shouldn't think that once that, like, the last missile is launched, that we're done. We shouldn't make the mistake we made in Afghanistan when the Soviets withdrew and kind of turn our back and walk away. We should stay engaged. We should, again, like investment, economic prosperity, because a lot of this disinformation stuff doesn't have any impact on people that are happy, that are satisfied, that are content. That's what I see in my own country. When you see the most emotion, it's when people are scared. And what are they often scared about? Losing their jobs, not having enough money to pay the bills, take care of their families, right? If they feel comfortable, they feel prosperous, they're not as susceptible to that fear. And so it's very important that, this is what I saw in my career in a lot of the countries I worked in, the economic development is critical. Now, sometimes to get economic development, you have to provide security assistance, because there are outside forces that are, whether they be state or non-state actors, trying to destabilize the economy of another country, because that's the way they can take power. So the U.S. is going to have to remain engaged. And then, of course, I always say, before the February of 2022, the expanded invasion of Ukraine, the Russians were conducting assassinations inside of Ukraine. They were doing sabotage inside of Ukraine. The only difference now between that and then is that the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can do the same, and they are doing it very effectively. And the Russians should remember that. So when the ceasefire happens, maybe they'll be less in a rush to assassinate somebody or conduct sabotage, a cyber attack, blow something up, because the Ukrainian intelligence services have demonstrated that they are also very good at it. And, if the Russians, and we know the Russians kind of live by the principle of an eye for an eye, oka za oka. Well, now there's a consequence. There wasn't maybe in 2014, 2015. Now there's a very serious consequence. And maybe it's in both sides' best interest, this kind of deterrence. Like, let's not do that. And then maybe, as I used to tell my Russian friends all the time, and not my friends either, but people I disagree with, maybe you should just try and view Ukraine as a partner for business and for development, and you'll benefit and they'll benefit, because they are a European country. They are the bridge to the rest of Europe. You're not going to jump over them, right? And you're never going to occupy them again. The Ukrainians have demonstrated they are not going to allow Russia to turn Ukraine into an extension of Russia again. There's no such thing as AllatRa, right? It is Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine are going to be Ukrainian. That doesn't mean they have to be the enemy. They could be actually good partners.
That's true. And I think it's already like a second time that when I ask, I think familiar question, and you coming back to this, the economical prosperity, and I really much agree. And thank you so much for emphasizing that, because I truly agree that the economically strong country, like you'll not be able to defeat, you will not be able to invade, you will not be able, right? If people are satisfied, happy, and basically it will be very hard, to have a battle with the very strong, economically strong country. So I truly wish that for Ukraine as well, and thank you for your suggestions and how you compare what happened with the Afghanistan. So that would be great that America would be involved and still involved even after the ceasefire and everything. And I truly appreciate our conversation. It's really helped to understand more this information warfare. Thank you so much for sharing this with our audience. Before probably we conclude, I can ask you a final questions. Maybe you can give a suggestion to any ordinary people how to not become a tool on somebody's informational operations. What would you suggest? Maybe some simple steps for any ordinary person?
Well, one, study, right? Learn, educate yourself. Look at the history of disinformation. There's a lot of great literature out there now, a lot of great books, YouTube videos, if you don't want to read, you don't have time, you're in the gym so that's one. Two, remember to just take a deep breath when you see information and say, okay, let me double check this. And it's not that hard today because there's a lot of information online too. So there's information, counter information. Just do some research, right? Don't become emotional right away, and understand that a lot of the algorithms that are being designed on the social media are designed to pull this response from you, this emotional response, right? And so you have to kind of counter that. You have to be your best source of counter disinformation. And the last point I'd say is remember that if you don't know something and you see information and that pulls out that kind of response, your desire should be, okay, I want to fill that vacuum what I don't know. If you don't really know Ukrainian history, this is why I was so proud of my students, because we were talking about a figure in Ukrainian history, and they started asking a lot of questions, and I said, okay, how much do you know of the history? Well, not a lot. And then they came back to me the next class and they said, we want to create a course on Ukrainian history because we see there's a vacuum, there's a void. We want to fill that void. That is the right response, right? And if we can do that, I think we're in a much better place than we are today in society, where there's a lot of voids and there's a lot of information being thrown at people and then a lot of emotional responses, which polarizes people, which divides people. And we should remember the only people that I'll just speak for the United States. Ask yourself, who wants us divided? Who wants Democrats to hate Republicans? Who wants African Americans to hate Caucasians? Who wants Asian Americans to hate Hispanic Americans? Divided, the divide and conquer approach, we see how it's worked in other places. Who shouldn't want that? We shouldn't want that. And that means that we should take the time and be disciplined enough to say, okay, did this really happen in this community, or did this pastor in this church, or did this imam really say that? Because we know during the 2016 election cycle, the Russians were putting information to different religious communities in the United States to try them to get to fight with each other. Why? Because they're trying to weaken society. They're trying to weaken society so that the government implodes, and then they can project their influence, and they can take, by the way, all the Americans listening, they want to take what you have. And they're going to do that without having to fire a shot if you don't show discipline. And instead of going to the gun range and, shooting, which, by the way, I like to do myself, but there's nothing wrong with that, but also take the time to read, because the best bullet you have, the best self-defense you have is your ability to think. So, and people are counting on us not wanting to think.
That's true. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise. I think it's a great conclusion, and it's a very good advice for everyone to think in every single country, and specifically for America, because I truly believe that United States of America, it's the real land of the free, and basically it's the country that can really help to prospers the entire world.
Right.
So we should safeguard here, the freedoms, and we should make sure that we're not staying divided, because we understand who benefits from that. Thank you again for your time.
Дякую. Супер дякую.
Дякуємо вам.